Sam and Paul improvisational show.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's supposed to be an outside class. So Sam and we were just discussing, we've taught this for 6 years now.
6 years, we think.
It's only the second time we've had to do it indoors. But the first time was in 2019, quite a while ago. And I don't think either one of us has delivered this PowerPoint since then. So we're going to make this, this is going to be a little bit, make it up as we go along. But Sam and I have both been pruning for many decades. So a lot of it's kind of all up here, not so much on here, but we'll use this kind of as a guide.
Really good illustrations that he's got on this PowerPoint, and I think what we're going to do is just dive right in, and we're going to cover the biology of behind pruning trees in the landscape, and the who, what, why, and how of pruning trees in the landscape. And then we'll cover the other things up there. Yeah, things to avoid. And also, I think at the end of this, your perspective on trees is going to change. We hope that really you're going to look at trees differently from here on out. You're going to walk by a tree and go, how would I prune it? I think you'll get enough of an experience with trees today to come away with that. And if that happens, then we've been a success for sure.
Now you should all have a handout, as Sophie mentioned, but let me give you a disclaimer on that handout. Is that handout was predicated on the outdoor session of this class. So the indoor session is not going to follow quite the same, but we will cover everything that's on that. All right, we'll start out with Dr. Reese's 5 axioms of tree pruning. So if you don't take anything away from today, take these 5 things away. Number 1, pruning is both an art and a science. What do we mean by that? There is a science to the cuts that you make, using the proper tool, making the proper cut at the proper location. That's a science, right? The tree is a biological organism. So we're talking about science here, but pruning also involves physics. So we'll talk more about that as well. So where does the art come in? Think of it this way. Pruning is a science because you got to make the right cut. Which cuts you make, that's the art part, okay? Number 2.
Good pruning job is like a good haircut. I think I'm illustrating, a situation where I've got bad hair today, so I just got my cap on. But if you've gotten a good haircut today or yesterday or something like that, somebody's going to go, haircut looks really good, but I'm not really sure exactly why. I can't tell what's been done. And a good pruning job is that. It should reflect a healthy tree without reflecting a whole lot of manipulation. Would be the idea that you would put on.
Number 3, your best pruning tool is your eyes. It's not a pruning saw. It's not a pruning hand pruners. It's not a chainsaw. It's your eyes. You always want to prune a tree with your eyes first before you ever pick up any implement to actually make a cut.
And that leads right into under pruning is always a better idea than over pruning. You pick up with your eyes what you feel like needs to be done, but then always start with the lightest hand so that you're not left with something that you're disappointed with or that you've done that's bad for the biology and the health of the tree. Because
number 5, you can't glue it back on. Okay? Once you make that cut, you've committed yourself. Okay? You can't glue it back on. People have tried. I once had a lady that called me up and said, I have this tree that broke apart in the storm and this limb is just hanging on by a thread. How do I fix it? I said, well, you don't, man. It's too far gone. You're going to have to just prune it off. She goes, oh, no, I can't. It's really important limb to this tree. And she just went on, and I could not convince her. And so finally I said, okay, go down to the hardware store or whatever and get yourself some grafting tape and tape it up like a Band-Aid. She goes, all right, I'll do that, and I'll call you back and tell you how it turns out. And I'm thinking, I know how it's going to turn out. It's not going to work. But.
all right. So yeah, we're going to be talking about landscape trees, health, safety, and aesthetics. Fruit trees, probably we'll delve into fruit trees a little bit, but that's its own little category. So it takes another type of skill sets to really do fruit pruning. And then Woodlands.
Yeah, if you have a small woodland, I mean, we're not gonna cover this tonight, but if you have a small woodland, you might want to do some pruning in order to get clearer lumber for eventually harvesting that tree. These are just sort of the categories or the reasons why we might prune, but it's important to kind of connect those pruning practices and principles with why you're pruning it. So most of tonight is going to really be about landscape trees. So trees in the environments, in your yard, in your neighborhood, in your parks.
And like this says here, there is a right way and many long ways to prune trees, and a lot of the right ways are based on tree biology. And I think maybe this would be a good time to step in a little bit about tree biology.
Well, we're going to get to code it and everything like that.
Okay, we got a little bit further along here. Okay.
So we said pruning is both an art and a science already, but it's also another way to think of this is that if you can prune a tree when it's young, when that tree is smaller, it's going to be cheaper, more cost effective, and it's going to be easier on the tree. Because as you'll find out in a few minutes here, when we're pruning a tree, what we're really doing is we're wounding that tree. We're doing it intentionally and we're doing it for the tree's benefit, but we are wounding the tree nonetheless.
And let's be realistic. I mean, part of the reason you're taking this class right now is so that you can be a volunteer in the community, I believe. And a lot of the cases that you'll be working on are trees that are newly planted young trees. As an example, here at the University of Tennessee, we've got 9,200 something trees on campus, but about 82% of those trees are in size class that's from 3 inches to 15 inches. That's a lot of trees, right? And so we spend most of our time pruning young trees. Diameter. And so these would be trees that would be anywhere from 12 feet to say 25 feet tall. And we're doing developmental pruning, very light touches, doesn't take a lot of time per tree, but we're probably making it so that the trees will last a lot longer in the future. And we'll see some examples of that. But I wager that you guys will be working on young trees for the most part after you finish up this course and do volunteer times with volunteer forestry.
All right, so what does good pruning look like? As Sam said earlier, it looks like a good haircut, but it's also dependent on the species. You know, what is a good pruning job for one species, like the black gum here, is not necessarily the same for an oak, because trees have different habits, they have different branch architecture or structure, what we call it, and good pruning is congruent with that. The key is not to interrupt the biological structure of the tree. So, you know, think of it like this. You've all seen crepe myrtle, right? Okay. So there's a right way to prune a crepe myrtle and a wrong way. The wrong way we refer to as crepe murder. It happens a lot. And why do people do that? Because they don't know. They don't understand that that's not how you should treat a tree. You know, you're dealing with a conifer, a genetically, what we call a cultivar, a genetically propagated species of some sort that's been designed for a form. This is an upright form. You're not going to make this a fat tree. It's not going to happen because it's biologically just destined to be, in this case, upright.
So here's I don't know where you start with this. There's so many things going on.
Start right here. Start right here.
All right. So yeah, there's a fail that was the beginning of a fail that was, they backed off on it. So there's a cut right there at the base of that wound.
Let me go back. Sorry.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So somebody tried to make a cut. They went in and then stopped.
Yeah. Then maybe they were rethinking everything they were doing. I don't know. But and so then there's that, and then there's that big, large Easter egg shaped wound there. Those are both wrong. They're violating the biology of the tree. And then we've got a stub over here that maybe it was probably a better situation for the tree. We'll see. We'll be talking about how trees close wounds and they don't heal wounds. And we'll see more about that. If you look right in there, you can see this roll of tissue at the bare wood. That's callus that's forming. The tree is trying to cover over that wound and enclose that decay inside the tree. But it's going to have a harder time because it's been pruned. outside of the boundaries, the natural boundaries of the tree.
So what you're seeing with this tree is because this cut was not made properly, it's starting to seal over that wound, but it's never going to work because they made an error right here. You got bark that's pulled down, and there's no way that callus tissue can come all the way up there and close that wound.
Here's another cut where it was basically the cut was made and the branch was allowed to just break off by itself. And a wound like this is harder to close. It'll be harder for the tree to cover that wound in enough time that decay won't form and get into the stem. And decay in the stem will eventually could potentially cause failure in the tree.
And we'll specifically show you the 3-cut method of how to avoid probably.
Ooh. Yeah, so everybody in the room knows what a bad haircut looks like, for sure. You know, topping breaks so many of the rules. And essentially, topping is pruning branches, if you want to call it pruning, between the inner nodes, right? In the middle part of the tree where there are no growing points that the tree can grow back from. So in this case, with the tree is doomed to sprout a bunch of the foliage that it lost back. And in the meantime, all of those stems will likely hollow out like a straw. And wherever those sprouts formed up, they will be weakly attached. And over time, they'll grow to be as big as those stems are, but weakly attached at a hollow straw, and will have the risk of failure in their future. And the rule about trees that have failed is that if they've failed once, they're likely to fail again.
All right, so let's get into the biology. We'll talk about the biology that underpins the practices that we do as arborists and as volunteer foresters. So I mentioned earlier that pruning is a form of wounding, okay? It's an intentional wounding of the tree, but we're doing it for the benefit of the tree. So if we don't do it properly, it becomes a detriment.
So pruning cuts that are made properly are going to more rapidly close, and they're going to more rapidly encapsulate the potential for decay inside the tree. There used to be this theory that a wounded tree created fungi and those fungi then created decay in the tree, but it's the other way around, really. And so when we have a branch point like this, I think this really illustrates it very well. I'm going to pass this around. Okay, so you've got a branch that formed here. It died naturally. And then the trunk started encapsulating that whole branch inside of the trunk. So this is trunk wood. This is branch wood. They grow in concert with each other, but the branch will always be encapsulated into trunk wood. So what we're trying to do when we prune is protect trunk wood and remove branch wood.
And when you look at that as it goes around, look at that juncture. It's a little bit like your arm going into your shoulder. It doesn't just go into your shoulder at a 45-degree right angle, right? You've got a socket there, not unlike that. All right, let's play Stump the Arborist. Why did the tree limb die by itself? Why did the tree do that?
It probably wasn't getting enough sunlight. And in that case, it wasn't getting enough nutrients to support itself. So although trees don't make cognitive decisions, they can make biological decisions. And in that case, the branch probably died because it wasn't getting enough sunlight. It was shed because it wasn't serving a purpose for the tree.
Okay, I can't stump it much. But anyway, what really happens there, as he said, is that the trees naturally self-prune themselves. So they'll shed those lower branches when they don't need them. All right, Sam alluded to this earlier. Stubs, topping cuts, and snagged ends are entry points for insect disease. And that is why we want to make sure that those cuts are made absolutely as correctly and as precisely as possible so that this the sealing process that we'll talk about in a moment can take place.
And preventative pruning is always preferred over corrective pruning. If you can anticipate the growth of the tree or see a branch that needs to be pruned off for some reason or another, it is better for that than if it were to fail and then you had to go in and fix it afterwards. Because if you saw that on that one pruning cut where the branch peeled down, usually when branches fail, the way they fail is they just peel over, and then you'll get this jagged wound at the base of the branch there. So,
And in a related concept, the larger the pruning cut you have to make, the larger the wound, and the longer that wound is going to take to seal. That's why, as I said earlier, you want to prune a tree when it's younger and smaller, because you're making smaller cuts, and the tree is going to be able to recover from that. If you're making a cut this big, that tree will close that wound fairly rapidly. If you're making a cut this big, it's going to take a long time. If you're making a cut this big, it may never happen.
and I was talking about on campus, we're trying to prune trees now for 25 years from now, so that we don't have to make those big cuts. We're making those judgment calls early. A lot of those trees that we'll be talking about this a little bit more. A lot of those trees that I was talking about that we're pruning often don't even have their first permanent major branches. So we're just pruning to keep the form going up, and what we're doing is setting the stage for the future canopy. The smaller the branch that you cut, the better the form of the trunk will be over time.
All right, let's take a moment to dive a little deeper here into this idea of trees of wounding. Understand that unlike you, trees have no wound healing process. Healing in the sense that trees cannot repair or replace injured tissue. Now you all can't see this, but right here I have a scar on my right hand. I have 4 titanium screws holding this bone together. Okay? I broke my hand 25 years ago. It's been a long time now. And thanks to the marvel of modern medicine, my hand is now as good as it was prior to me breaking my hand. Were I a tree, this would be a completely different story. Why? Because I, as a human, have the ability to grow new tissue and to seal off that wound. And I've got a little scar here, but my hand's as good as new. If I was a tree, instead of healing that, what I would do is I would seal it. There's a difference between healing and sealing. I would seal off that wound, and that wound would always be there. It would just be covered up with new tissue. So trees can grow new tissue, but they can't repair tissue, and that's an important difference. And we'll talk a little bit throughout the evening that there are a lot of combinations or a lot of parallels between human health and tree health. This is not one of them, okay? You have the ability to heal. Trees do not. So somebody came up earlier and was talking about a wound they saw and about how long it would take to heal. The answer is it will never heal. It will seal properly. Hopefully it will seal properly, but maybe improperly depending on the situation.
Trees have internal boundaries that get put in place when we prune them. So the really, literally at the instant we make a pruning cut on a tree, things start to happen. One of the things that starts to happen is the cells that are arranged in alignment like tubes in the tree start to fill up with the waxy material called pilosins. We won't test you on that name or anything like that. But what that purpose of that is to start the sealing process immediately so that bacteria and fungi, air can't get into those wounded areas and move up the stem. That's known as wall 1. Do we want to talk?
No, we'll get into the slides.
All right. So hold that thought.
Yeah. So important thing to remember about trees and wounding then is it's impossible to heal the injured and infected xylem or those tubes that Sam was talking about, but trees can seal that up. Right? So what does it look like? Well, this is a cross section of a tree. And you can see here that when a proper pruning cut is made, right here, that tree is generating tissue, and then it's generating cells that will start to wall that off. If you make an improper cut, like this one, they've cut into that boundary that Sam was talking about, and made a flush cut here. and the disease is already getting into the tree.
Yeah, so you got discoloration there and there, but where do we have discoloration here? Just right in this area. And so that's coated, or that's decay sealing in action right there. And if we were to dissect the piece of wood that's going on, it would look like this one on the right. We would see how the tree had slowed down that process of allowing decay to form, discoloration decay to form into the stem.
All right, I've been holding it back. Sam has been dying to tell you about coating, so go for it.
That's right. So coating, the compartmentalization of decay in trees. Coating, C-O-D-I-T.
So you've all seen it. You just probably haven't known the name of it. When you
Exactly.
walk up to a tree and see this big callus tissue, that's one of the walls you're looking at. That's a coated process.
Exactly. We were looking at that. That was that was an illustration, a dissection of coated in the process. This piece of wood that's going around illustrates coated really well. So you've got, essentially, we'll just look at it like it's a box sort of, maybe more pie shaped, but you start out with that wall one that I was talking about. So you can see on the illustration here,
yep.
This is wall one forming here, wall one's trying to form here. You got wall one trying to form here, trying to seal off the upward and downward movement of decay process. And then wall two is right at the point of wounding, where it's at the back of the live cells that have been removed, and that mostly is going to be wood tissue that doesn't have any growing points, the ability to cover over and seal. Wall three is the lateral movement. Those are the rays. They're the ones that arrange themselves in a radial fashion towards the center of the tree. That sort of creates that pie-shaped look to it because they will follow that form of the rays. And then wall four is that callus material that we see that grows around the outside of the wood.
So realistically, when you're looking at a tree and you're seeing coated in work, you're only seeing wall four for the most part. Everything else is internal.
And then when you see wall four working really well, what you'll see is roughly a well-formed circular wound that is covered with a donut-shaped callus tissue. Ideally.
At this point, we would show you a whole lot of those out in the gardens here.
That's
But
right.
we're going to show you it on a slide.
Right.
So the key to know is that trees are highly ordered, compartmentalized plant.
All right, when you say wall, it's not, I wasn't quite sure what you're saying, but it's like the defense line.
That's right.
of the tree.
Exactly.
So
And is it in order of steps, like one is finding.
no,
Yeah.
they're not sequential.
Yeah.
They're just numbered. So if
Right.
if you have your hard time wrapping your idea around wall, consider it a barrier.
That's a big.
It's really what it is. It's a barrier. It's not a literal wall. You just call it a wall because what the tree is trying to do is trying to wall off that spread of decay. That's why we call it a wall.
If you so like as an illustration of wall two here, right? If you were to in the future, well, this tree was cut down and dissected, you would see a boundary line that would form that would come all the way around, formed by wall two, that was attempting to try to make sure that the interior of the tree didn't get affected by the decay. So that's what wall two's responsibility is. Wall four is to encapsulate all that inside of that activity.
And sometimes all four walls come to fruition, and sometimes only some.
Right.
So coated in action, what happens if the wall fails to close? Well, you look at it, wall four here, it didn't close. It kind of went into these little ram's horn things here. It didn't close that gap, and the decay went all the way to the back of the tree.
And that's a crack that would potentially fail all the way through the tree. It's a hollow shell of itself. So like you said, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes that's a factor of species. Certain species are better compartmentalizers than others. And that's hard to illustrate in the indoor setting, but that's something to look for.
But here it is. All
Let's see, I gotta read over this real quick.
So, so part of this is, think about oak. How many of you, you're probably familiar with oak trees. Oak grows actually in all 48 continental U.S. There's an oak tree that will grow in all 4 of those. At least one oak native in all 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska, no. But think about oak. It's a strong tough wood, right? So you would think that is a good compartmentalizer because it's pretty decay resistant. If you know anything about any of these trees that are on this other list here, they're all pretty weak wooded. So I spent a lot of my career in the western U.S. where we have a lot of cottonwood trees. Not quite so many cottonwoods around here, but we used to say that you could make a cottonwood fail just by walking past it and sneezing. I mean, it literally is very brittle wood, and it just always falls apart.
Can you define what you mean when you say fail?
When a branch breaks out of a tree, or if the trunk breaks over in a wind.
It doesn't mean the same thing as that.
No.
Not necessarily. Well, if it falls over, it could die.
Yeah, if it uproots.
But if it chucks out a limb, that's a failure. That's considered a tree failure.
Yep.
So let me put it to this way.
A good question.
It's a very good question, but let me put it to this way. Trees, what trees do is they bend and sway in the wind. Okay, kind of like what I'm doing right now. See that? Probably not on the camera. I'm bending and swaying, right? What the tree does when it bends and sways like that is it develops a certain adaptive wood that kind of helps hold it in place. So when a tree, so we're going to have high winds tonight or tomorrow. There's already a high wind warning out, and you're going to see some tree damage. Why are you going to see the tree damage? You're going to see the tree damage because there are certain thresholds. Now think of it this way. I use you. I did this last time. I did this last time.
Right.
Sam's kind of a big guy here, right? Okay, so I'm going to start pushing on Sam here, right? Okay, so he's going to resist me, right? That is what a tree does. It resists wind. Pretend I'm wind, right? So at some point, I could push him with enough force, so the wind pushes the tree with enough force that it's going to break the threshold. It's going to knock him off his feet, right? So what you just saw was that Sam was bending as I was pushing on his shoulder, and at some point he had to break his stance because the pressure that I was putting on his shoulder was such that that's what happened. So same thing happens with the tree. Trees have these thresholds where they bend and sway in the wind, but if the wind is strong enough, or car hits it, or whatever it happens to be, that limb will break. It will fail, okay? And it fails because it breaks that threshold. Make sense?
And that movement that he was talking about, that bending and swaying, helps the tree to develop the tension that allows the tree to remain under that force for a lot longer than it would if it didn't have that strength inherently into it. You have to remember, trees grow in place. They can't run away from their attackers. They are super survivors because of all the complex systems that are developed in their structure.
That's similar to like if you're building muscle, like you're doing kind of tiny micro fractures and it's kind of making it harder each time.
She's pushing us right into tension and compression.
She is. I think that's a couple of slides down, but we can talk about it if you want to.
Like
Okay.
it's more just that
All
if
right.
they like you're supposed to
Yeah.
a little bit stronger.
There is certainly an analogy there. All right.
Yeah.
Everybody stand up.
Yeah, we got an active.
All right. Audience participation time. For those of you watching online, go ahead and do the same. Stand up.
You ever wondered why a branch stand off the tree like this? All right.
All right. Right hand in the air. Bend to your left. Now, what do you feel? You're popping. That's not a good sign. Okay, don't go too far.
You're at the
Okay.
point of failure.
You feel two things actually. Right here on your left side, you feel compression because what you're doing is you're compressing your muscles. On your right side, you feel tension because you're tensioning your muscles. Put your hand down. Trees do the same thing, only that once they get like that, they stay like that. Okay? You move back and forth. You sit down now. You move back and forth. Trees don't move back and forth such that they move back and forth to develop that tension wood and that compression wood to help them stand up. Now, how many of you have ever seen a tree that looks like this? Okay, why? What's coming from this direction? Wind, or maybe another tree that's suppressing it, right? What that tree has done is it's done adaptive growth to allow it to stand up. Sam, put your arm up for me. Okay. So what trees have the ability to do is compression wood and tension wood. Now, that's how it gets to hold the branch up too. So a branch, imagine I'm a trunk and this is a branch. This is what? Tension. This is what? Compression, exactly. How long? Oh, get your hand up. How long do you think Sam can hold his arm up? Maybe
Let's
I'll
not
take
take
guess.
bets on this.
Take bets on this.
No, let's not do that.
Over or under? Depends on how much wine he's had.
None yet.
Okay.
You're gonna drive me to drink it.
Why can't Sam hold his arm up indefinitely? Gravity, exactly. So the tree has this adaptive growth so that it can defy gravity. It's exactly what
I
trees
don't
do.
have that developmental structure that could allow me to hold.
Exactly,
it like this
because you're not
for a long
treating.
time. That's right, yeah. But imagine my arm being a span on a bridge. How do we hold bridges up? We put buttresses underneath them, right, to add compression, and we put cables across them to hold them in place. So if you imagine imaginary cables doing that job, but they're in a line inside the tree. They're serving that purpose inside the tree. Tension and compression.
So that's essentially compression. We'll probably get to this again later in the slideshow. All right, we jumped ahead. But so let's look at a wound closure profile. So this is just after pruning. Here's the same tree as coated starting to happen. Another year goes by, another year goes by. What do you notice? You're noticing that wall 4 getting thicker and thicker. Put a little tape measure on that. We're seeing the wound size is closing. Closing more, closing more, closing more, closing more, to the point where it's finally closed. Okay? So when you walk up to a tree, and we would do this outside, if you could tonight, you'd walk up to a tree and you'd see like what looks like a target or something that looks like a round thing. That was once a branch. Might have been 5 years ago, might have been 15 years ago, I don't know. But that was once a branch. Okay.
And it was pruned off properly, I think.
Yeah.
It looks like it did a good job of closing that over. And the person that did the pruning did a pretty good job too. There's a couple of structures that we haven't really discussed either. Trying to get into collars and wrists.
No, that's coming up. That's coming up.
You have to, yeah, he's more familiar with this PowerPoint than I am, but we kind of know the drill. You know how to, we'll get there.
We'll get there. All right.
Or we'll let you just take over and make suggestions and we'll take off.
All right. So let's talk about the why, the who, the when, and the how to of good pruning practice. First of all, have a goal.
Yeah. So I use the example of the campus. Safety for us means a lot of things, but if you've got 82% of your trees are young trees and they're all around 25 feet tall, you're going to have branches that are in conflict of street signs and nighttime lighting, visibility at street corners and things like that. That's one component of safety that we pay attention to a lot. But if you've got a population of trees that are very mature, the safety component turns into how is my branch attachment up in the tree? We have branches that need some attention that may have some cracks, or large dead branches. Large dead branches that can come out of a tree, people and property are at very great risk in those situations. So the types of trees that you're looking at, the size of the trees that you're looking at, kind of define what safety means to your tree population or that individual tree.
Obviously, when we prune a tree, we want to do it so it becomes healthier. So it becomes an asset. It maintains an asset, being an asset to the landscape than a liability. And that has to do with the appearance of the tree. You know, we want the tree to look good. We want it to accent the landscape as its purposes.
And, I keep going back to the young trees, but for tree health, in our case, it will be about mature tree health just as much as it is about
So not pruning a tree is always an option, but it might be the case where you decide not to prune a tree. You're just actually pushing that decision down the road when somebody else has to make it, and it becomes a tougher pruning job.
And the growth habits of certain trees a little bit hard to describe here, but, you know, there are trees that will, you know, let's say that there's trees growing at the margins of a forest or something like that, and they will grow towards the light, and they will get a natural lean to them. Sometimes you may want to offset some of that lean, especially if changes to the forest behind it come along, so that you don't have as much of an effect on that lean and that odd shape. But that last line, they can cause structural problems as well.
Yeah. The structural problems, that once a tree starts to develop structural problems, talk more about those in a moment here. Once a tree starts to develop structural problems, it doesn't miraculously cure itself from that. Those just become more problems. All right, so who should prune a tree? It really depends on the size and the complexity of the task. Generally, as Sam mentioned earlier, your pruning that you're probably going to do is with hand tools, not necessarily with chainsaws, and with both feet hopefully firmly planted on the ground. I can't tell you how many accidents I've seen or how many stories I've heard about people trying to prune a tree on a ladder with a chainsaw. As a matter of fact, I have a friend, I have an acquaintance who's a New York City firefighter, is now retired, and he'll tell you about the most expensive pruning job he ever did. Had a tree in his backyard that he wanted to take a limb off. So he put his ladder up there, got his chainsaw out, started cutting it, and as he cut it, the limb started to fall away, but instead of the limb falling down, it fell towards him on the ladder. Knocked him off the ladder, and as he was flying through the air backwards, he had the presence of mind to ditch the chainsaw so it didn't land on him. Several broken vertebrae later, he would tell you that he should have hired an arborist.
Yeah, the moment you think you need to get on a ladder and take care of something, don't do it. That's when you should make the decision that it's time to hire an arborist or a roofer or a gutter guy. Yeah, you know, I mean, it applies to a lot of different professions.
It does. Good one. Realize that the term arborist is a largely unregulated term. Okay, you can't call yourself a doctor unless you have a doctor license or a doctoral degree, but you can call yourself an arborist if you have a pickup truck and chainsaw. Okay. In lieu of government regulation of arborists, there's actually a voluntary certification program run by a group called the ISA, which stands for the International Society of Arboriculture. Sam and I are both active in that organization. And they, in 1991, actually even into the late 80s, developed a certification program for arborists. It's a 200-question exam that you have to take, and you have to have 3 years of experience working with trees before you sit for that. And then you have to gain recertification credits by going to programs like this one to keep your certification current. And there are some 38,000, I think is the last number I heard, 38,000 certified arborists worldwide, including Sam and myself. And if you're looking to hire someone to do tree work, you want to look for a certified arborist, because that's the only measure that's out there of what someone knows. You know, you can own a tree service company, you can have good chainsaws, you can have all the equipment, but unless you have an ISA arborist certification, the public doesn't really necessarily know that you are someone who knows how to properly prune trees.
They're going to have the requisite education to know not to top trees. They should know the basics. Well, they should know more than the basics of tree biology and why pruning is important and when to stop, and not, you know, do pruning jobs that, you know, that looks like they justify their work by how much material landed on the ground. So that's what you should get when you're certified.
When do we prune trees, Sam?
When they need it. You know, that I get that question all the time. I'm not sure. I haven't read through this in a minute, but you know, if we're talking about seasons, there's a good time to prune trees. There's a season for pruning trees. Starting with when they need it, if you perceive a need like large dead branches over your driveway or over the street or over the yard, then it's probably a good time to start pruning out dead branches. And that may be all you need to do for your tree. When they're encroaching on your property in some way, can't see your driveway anymore, yeah, it probably needs to get pruned. Can't see your roof any longer, or or the branches are so heavy that the gutters are starting to lean off the side of the house, probably needs to get pruned. Is that what you were
Yeah,
asking?
so generally you can prune dead wood anytime. Live wood, it's better to prune it while when the tree doesn't have leaves on it, deciduous, for example. You want, remember, pruning is a type of stress to the tree, so you don't want to, if it's like really hot and dry outside, you may not want to prune, because that's just an additional stress that tree's going to have.
Wintertime is one of the answers that usually comes out of my mouth when somebody asks me, when should I prune my tree? Winter is probably the best time. We live in stressful times, and plants are under stress quite a bit. Winter is probably the least stressful time for most trees, unless they're getting frozen by super cold temperatures. However, that's also the case that it's a good time to prune because you have less disease and insect factors in the environment as well. We have a lot of disease complexes now that are encouraged by pruning in the summertime. So if you're pruning off live branches, removing live tissue, they're very susceptible to certain types of disease. There's a disease called oak wilt that will get into oaks. We're not really in that region that we know of for sure. But north of here, Kentucky and Ohio River Valley, that disease is very important. And arborists up there know you don't prune oak trees in the summer because they will get oak wilt.
What about right after planting?
Oh, I love to prune trees right when we plant them, because it's right there on the ground. It's right in front of me. I can correct a few issues before it goes in the ground. So I like to prune trees right as they're getting planted or right after that.
But that's one time you don't want to over prune.
That's true.
Why? Because that tree needs those branches to photosynthesize and make energy.
But if I were to get a tree that had, like it has this codominant stem, this sort of unbalanced, these two are trying to approach the same height of each other, I could correct this one. This is the smaller of the two. I could correct this one, prune it back just like it did here. It could prune this back a little bit, and this one will take over the dominant role in the tree more effectively. And that's a simple one cut. I cut one little section of the tree off at planting.
We'll get into those in a moment. Okay. How should trees be pruned? Pruning is a deliberate act. Right? You shouldn't just go out, I'm going to go out and prune today. Clip. That's not the way to do it. You want to prune with a lot of forethought, a lot of foresight, according to standards, and with proper tools at the proper time. Now, what do I mean standards? Everybody look up above you, there's a light. Okay? That light has a standard to it. What that standard is, it's a set of printed instructions, if you will, or guidelines. But the light has to do with the voltage, the size of watts of the light bulb itself, how it's grounded, how it's attached to the ceiling. Those are all standards. So if we were to call an electrician in, he or she would be able to tell me everything about that light bulb and about how that light fixture and about how it probably should be installed, right? Sam, is there something like that for trees?
There is. The American National Standards Institute writes standards for all sorts for light fixtures, I believe. But they got into the process of writing standards for the horticulture industry in the 70s through some advocates, family members who had lost family members to tree injuries or accidents. And so the first ANSI standards were standards for tree care operations, doing the physical work of trees. And in the 1990s, the late 1990s, we started developing standards for pruning. So we have the A300 standards for pruning. And essentially, it gives us 4 broad guidelines of the types of pruning that we would normally do on trees. That would be crown thinning. Crown thinning would be the removal of interior branches, opening up the canopy to allow wind to move through it, allow a little bit more sunlight to penetrate the canopy, but not overdoing it. So there's also some discussion about how much is too much. Crown cleaning, we talked about dead wood removal. It would be removal of dead branches to a defined size. So if you talk to an arborist, he's going to say, we need to crown clean your tree. They should also talk to you about what size they're going to prune to. They might leave the 1 inch dead branches, but anything bigger than 1 inch, they would take out. Or they might say, no, you got too many 1 inch dead branches. We're going to take everything larger than 3/4 of an inch. But that's a definition. It's a standard that they've established by communicating with you. Got crown raising. So we do a lot of crown raises. Crown raise up over the sidewalks and the streets. We set a standard that should be about 8 feet. Why do you think 8 feet? People aren't 8 feet tall generally. We don't wear top hats much anymore.
I know. Why is it 8 feet? So
Yeah, not for people.
no.
Yeah,
8 feet for
sidewalks,
people, for sidewalks.
but for sidewalks.
Oh, wait, I do know this one.
Yeah, yeah.
Back on that umbrella.
Yeah, think about today.
Average
There's a
height of
lot
someone
of people
holding an
walking
umbrella
around
is 8
today
feet.
with umbrellas, and so, it sticks up, you got a 6-footer, and you got a couple of feet sticking over you, you got about 8 feet right there.
All right, and it's 14 feet up for vehicles. Why? Your car's not 14 feet tall. What's 14 feet tall? Correct, a hook and ladder fire truck.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, and proper tools, we already kind of talked about proper time. We'll get to the rest of that in a minute. So let's kind of dive in now to the,
Paul?
yes,
Question.
yes.
Is there the standard variant with the aesthetics of the tree? In other words, you trim a tree.
So yes, so like when you plant a tree, good question. So when you plant a tree, you might plant a 6-foot tall tree. How are you going to get 8 feet of clearance on a 6-foot tall tree? No, you have to do that. Okay, so yeah, that's your goal of what you're trying to reach. So as the tree gets larger, you're going to prune it accordingly to the point where when that tree is 16 foot tall, you're going to have 8 feet. Why? Because there's something called live crown ratio. You always want to maintain a 50% live crown ratio on a tree. Never want to have a 10-foot tall tree with only 2 feet of foliage on the top, right? You want a 10-foot tall tree with 5 feet of foliage at least.
And I was also thinking the type of tree would affect the way
It would, yes. The
Yeah.
species of the tree would, yes. You're
So
right.
in a case like that, where you've got a tree that's not, obviously not reached the 16-foot or the 14-foot threshold to prune the branches off, but it is in this, like cityscapes, it's in a confined space between the curb and the sidewalk. You would often do reduction cuts that would leave the branch in place, but reduce the length of the branch back to the curb line. And you do that up the tree until you get to that point where it's clear of the object that has to go by the tree. There's a good example.
All right,
How are we gonna do this?
meet Woody. My daughter says that's a dad joke, sorry. Okay, so we would normally do this outside. Can't do this outside because of the weather tonight, so we brought some volunteers with us, cadavers.
Yes.
So Sam's gonna show you, you're gonna prune all over.
Okay, all right.
When we look at a tree in the landscape, the first thing we want to say is, what are we looking for? And some of these are really easy. If we've got a dead branch or a crossing branch or branches that are rubbing, easy removal. We want to prune it to think about how do we improve the structure of this tree for the future. Now that's pretty easy with this one because it's got a really funky top. Okay. Dan, tell us about apical dominance.
I'm trying to put the words together on.
It's not there. It's
Right,
not there.
Exactly. So apical dominance is the apical bud at the end of the branch.
Another one.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that's a little better.
the terminal bud is called the apical bud, and let's just, I'm going to straighten this up a little
Yeah,
bit.
go
And
ahead.
we'll say this is the apex of the growing point of the tree. All right, and that's the one that we want to continue building on itself and going up. So all of these are temporary branches. We know that our first branch, if we're next to a street, is probably going to be no lower than about 16 feet on the trunk of the tree. We've got a long ways to go for there. So this apical bud, we want to keep it continuing moving up, not this one bud, but the buds that come after it in the line of this structure. So when we want to support apical dominance or restore apical growth, then we try to figure it out with this
This is probably a weird example,
shepherd
but
crook.
Act like that's, a great turtle. How-
yeah.
how much to restore?
So what happened? Let's say this lost its top, which is obviously what happened. It lost its top, right? And so there's a couple things you could do. You got to make a choice, right? If it's a young tree, and I've actually done this, I've taken a bamboo pole and taped it like this, and then I've gone like this and just taped that. But you can't do this with a mature tree because it will never work. But with a young tree, you could actually sort of force that into position to being a lead, what we call a leader, or the apical dominance of the tree, right? And then what Sam was talking about earlier was, well, what if you have to, like this situation? Well, then you got to decide if one of these has to be subordinated by either remove it completely or cut it here so it goes off in a different direction. So those are sort of the decisions you got to make, is how are you going to improve that tree structure?
So we've got some options here. Like he said, we could prune it back to here, right? So that's a possibility.
I'm not taking it home with me, so.
Right, yeah, right. And then, there is also the chance that this stem will try to grow and get into position ahead of this one. So if we think that could happen, we'll just prune back to another growing point or another branch node, and that will slow this branch down and allow this one to take over in a more dominant position. If we had to be drastic, if we really had to be drastic about it, and we didn't have any good structure up here, then we could come back even farther, this far back. Yeah. And then this would be what you would have left.
Now, the reason he's making that cut right here is because there's this branch here to direct the growth in. He's not making it here because that would be a topic cut, right? But
right.
The way he's doing it here is it's an effective cut because it's going to drive the growth off into that direction of where he wants it.
And with a lot of species, you won't get a lot of profuse sprouting if you prune back to that structure there instead of pruning in between nodes. Trees have hidden bud structures called latent buds or epidormant buds and that's another survival feature for trees. The top gets blown out in a storm. Those latent buds will be released because sunlight starts to reach that spot on the trunk, and you'll get sprouting, and the tree will ultimately survive or regrow its lost top.
So this is all about, sort of looking at the tree before you ever make a cut and decide, well, do I need to improve the structure? Do I need to provide clearance? Do I need to increase light and air into the tree? And what aesthetically, what do I want that tree? Right. I think we jumped ahead a little, we probably should have done this earlier. You have a tool in your hand. Let's talk about tools real quick.
Oh, okay. All right. So I've got a bypassing pruner. All right. So the reason it's called a bypass is you've got a blade and a hook, and the blade passes the hook and makes the cut. So you pinch the wood between the hook and the blade and it makes the cut. Bypasses, makes a relatively clean cut.
And I have a very sharp handsaw here. If you notice that the teeth are very close together and it cuts both directions on push pull.
That's right. All right. Let's see, what else have we got?
You got some tall ones.
Yeah, we've got, so these are extension pole saw and pole pruner. So very essentially the same as he has, but now I've added a few feet to my reach. And these come in a lot of different forms. These are, of course, designed, to be attached to each other so that you can get more and more reach with it all the time. And it's got this hook on it so that you can reach in and pull them down. So functional tool. And this is a pruner, so the rope is here, and then it pulls down on the pulley and bypass cuts. It's a bypass pruner.
It's basically a big boy version of this.
And it's got a lot of leverage, so it'll cut some fairly large. This will cut just under an inch, but they make pruners that will prune up to 1.5 to 2 inches.
And most of those are telescoping, so he's got it dense, or he's got, obviously doesn't have the bottom piece, but you can telescope it up and you can get it, you can get 10, 20 feet into the tree. But the further out you have that telescopic pole, the less leverage you have, and it's harder to make a good.
There's a lot of tools out there, a lot of different ways that you can get, different types of tools that you can get. Buy the best quality tool that you can afford to buy. It'll last you a long, long time. I've had this pruner head 30 something years.
This is one of my favorite saws. I probably haven't taken as good care of it. It looks a little dirty, but it's a Fano saw, and I bought it from Rob Fano himself.
Oh, there you go.
A couple
There you
saw
go.
sales with. It's a great saw.
Yeah. We should talk about safety a little bit. There's a couple of things you want to know about. These are sharp tools. We've already said that. Never grab a pruner by its head and pull on it, because the rope at the other end might try to pull the pruner and close it. So always pull the pruner. If it gets hooked on something, just try to work itself out, but always store it by the handle so that you can reach it by the handle when you're not tempted to grab it by the head.
Never stick the pruners into your pocket like this.
That's right.
Don't ask me how I do.
Don't use it as a tool like a screwdriver, right? Or I used to do a lot of irrigation work, and I didn't have any tool to open up the irrigation box, so I just opened up my pruner and put the hook in there, and my hand slid, and I cut it on. So those things happen. Other thing about safety is these can reach a long ways, and the last thing you want to be doing is working with tools around energized conductors. So if there's a power line in the tree and you have the need, it's kind of like the ladder. If you see the power line, it's time to call somebody else to do that work for you. You don't want to get close to those guys. These are fiberglass poles. Theoretically, they should be energy neutral, but I wouldn't trust them. Not around energy.
All right, time to get into the actual techniques of pruning. But before we do that, we want to do a 5-minute bio break.
Yeah.
All right, leg stretch. Reconvene here. We're going to talk about some pruning techniques, which is sometimes called target pruning. And it's called that because there's very specific things that we're trying to achieve in this process. So we've got some cadavers up here that Sam and I are going to work on a little bit here and talk about. These are young, small branches. They're not trees themselves. So the physical structures are not exactly parallel, but close. So some terms you really need to know. Sam, you want to cover these?
Sure. So we touched on it a little while ago. We're talking about the structures that are very important to the tree. I was talking about branch wood and trunk wood in relationship to this piece of wood here. And so trunk wood is where he's pointing right now. All right. And that is defined by the branch collar. So it's a swollen area that is not only at the base of the branch, but goes around the branch up to another structure called the branch bark ridge.
Here's a good example of a branch collar right there.
And it's a great illustration of it because it looks like a collar. You can see the branch growing out of that point. There's trunk wood growing around or grasping branch wood. And that's what that branch bark collar is doing. And then the branch bark ridge is where you have trunk wood and that's around the branch intersecting with stem wood above it, creating a little ridge that crumples that trunk wood. But that is trunk wood. And we want to protect the trunk when we prune trees. And then outside of that swollen area is the branch.
So looking at this in practice, here's an actual photograph of rather than a drawing. Here's the collar. You can see that swelling. Here's the ridge. You can see the ridge forming there. And if you're thinking about making a cut, not every tree is going to have this handy-dandy little guide here that tells you yes and no. But this example, the photographer is a friend of ours at Gilman and on this tree. You don't want to take this cut right here, because if you do that, you're cutting into that branch bark collar and you're removing all of those auxins. That might not be a word you're familiar with. A-U-X-I-N. There's a Scrabble word for you. What do you X? A-U-X-I-N. Auxin basically means hormone. And auxins are these hormones that are in here that once that limb is removed, those auxins activate and start the coated process. So you go, yeah, if he said, yes, cut right here, so that coating can take place, no, right here, because then you'd be actually removing some of those chemicals or hormones.
So that would be a yes, that's where you want your last cut to be. When you walk away, that's where you want your last cut to be. But before you get to that, you have to do the 3-part cut.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a
Three-part
second.
cut.
Yeah,
So we're gonna-
that's coming. That's
Yeah.
coming. So as he said, oftentimes the weight of the branch must first be removed with preliminary cuts so that you don't strip that down. And we'll show you exactly what that looks like. Go ahead.
Yeah, so imagine you've got this branch on this illustration is 15 feet long. And if you were to make that cut right there where the yes line was, what the result of that would be with that branch, the weight of that branch would take it down and it would peel it off and it would destroy trunk wood below the branch bark column. And so to avoid that, you make a 3-part cut. You make your first cut underneath the branch, no more than about a halfway in. If it's a long branch, what will happen is the branch weight will try to close and capture your saw, then you're stuck. And then you might have to go get another saw out. So you want to cut until you cut into it about a third, no more than a half, and then step out the branch. And in this case, it looks like it's 3 or 4 inches, a distance out on the branch, and make another cut that will eventually bypass that first cut, and they will magically snap apart because the cells line up in the length linearly on the branch, and as you make that bypass, they'll just separate away. And so then you won't get peeling down the branch down to the branch bark collar and damage the trunk.
And that's really what you're trying to avoid here. I mean, imagine this is a much bigger branch. If I just were to make a cut here, the weight of that would just go like this and would rip and tear and make a very poor wound that coating would have trouble covering. So by doing a cut that involves multiple, or a procedure that involves multiple cuts, as Sam said, do you want to illustrate on the one? So,
I'm
yeah.
just going to imagine that this branch is.
So he's going to make a top cut here. I'm sorry, those of you in the back probably can't see this too well, but he's going to make a top cut. And he's only going to cut halfway into no more than halfway into the tree.
Yeah.
Right here. This is the first cut, the undercut, rather.
Yeah.
So you're going to make that undercut. And you always make the undercut first because why? Well, that's where all of that compression is, right?
So yeah, I know you can't see it. This is very narrow curve, but I've bypassed my first cut right here, and here is my top cut that has bypassed it. And when the weight gets strong enough, and I'll pass that around, you can see.
And that's exactly what happens, in that, and it'll be a loud crack too. I mean, if you're,
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a branch that's 3 inches in diameter, it's actually a pretty loud crack. But what it is that again, it's that tree breaking those thresholds.
There's a lot of weight. If you're
Yeah.
cutting an entire branch off, that it's going to have a lot of weight. You can imagine the weight of the limbs. It might even have food on it. It'll have a fair amount of weight on it.
Then the last cut you make then is right next to the branch collar, and you're only cutting, a small piece of wood that's maybe a few inches long, but it no longer has all that weight on it.
Ideally, you'd be able to make the cut because you're not on a ladder and you're not working way up above your head. And you might even be able to hold that stub while you make the cut so that you're able to really finish that cut cleanly all the way through
Yeah.
the final stroke.
So here's the final cut right here. This is what it looks like. This is an excellent cut. I mean, that's like an award-winning cut.
You'll get that perfect little donut when it closes,
Yes.
and the wound closes for sure.
So do you really want to do it right at the top of the collar, or would you want to cut out an inch or so beyond that for any reason?
You can go out beyond for safety's sake, for sure. I mean, you're cutting branch wood if you stay outside of the ridge and the collar, and trying to bypass that perpendicular to the line of the branch. as close
And
as.
it's not always, I mean, not every tree has a branch that goes out just like this. Sometimes they go like this, they go like this, or they go like this. And so sometimes the technical term is crotch, sorry, but sometimes the crotch is just like so narrow that you have to cut out because you can't get a saw in that close.
And it'll often be indistinct. You may not have that really well-defined collar and ridge, but you start looking and you'll start seeing.
If you do this, even if the branch is already dead.
Yes.
Right, yes.
Because even if it's dead, it still has weight to it.
Yeah, you would definitely want to do that even if it was dead.
All right, a couple of cuts that we need to chat a little bit about that are a little less common are a reduction cut. I guess that's the only one I'll talk about. You want to talk about reduction cuts?
Yeah.
So most of what we're talking about is removal cut, where we're removing you see these dotted lines here. We're making a cut that removes or prunes a branch back to the parent branch of the trunk. Sometimes you have to do a reduction cut, and that reduction cut is different than a topping cut because you're making it at a particular juncture, and you're making it for a reason that here's a good example. So let's say I got a branch that's broken here, and I want to go and I want to make that reduction cut. I'm reducing the height of it a little bit, but what I'm doing is I'm directing the growth out here this way. I'm reducing the height, but I'm doing it by making a proper cut. It's much different than topping cut, which would be just an indiscriminate cut, anywhere to reduce the top of the
So I'm
tree.
going to pass this around. I will illustrate the reduction cut.
Generally, a reduction cut is you're reducing. It's not always the height of the tree. Sometimes you're just reducing the length of a branch.
Okay.
So I had a branch that was headed towards my porch, right? Well, I didn't want to remove the branch all the way to the trunk because I thought that would make the tree lopsided. So what I did was I just at first when you do this, it can look a little funny. So if I was using this one for an example, I might the example would be like this. So let's say this is headed towards something I don't want it to, but I'm okay with this. So I might make that cut. Now that cut's a little unusual and it's got an angle like that, but that will grow out of that, right? It will recover from that. So, but initially the cut might look a little funny.
So as you're looking at this, we've made reduction cuts back to a node or growing point that will take on a new position for the tree, permanent position, or at least a temporary or permanent position, depending on the size of the tree. If you see the illustrations, it's probably hard to see these from there, but the top one that we're looking at on the right-hand side, he's done a reduction illustration of a reduction cut on the right-hand side where that lowest branch, the dotted line shows where the reduction cut was made and what was remained.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And so we do that all the time on campus because he was talking earlier about how you want to measure, you don't want to get too large a cut on the trunk of the tree. If you were to use your mind's eye on that, the size of that branch where it's attached to the trunk might be almost half the diameter of the tree, of the parent stem. And if we take a branch off that's half the size of the parent stem, it's too large, even if it's 2 inches. And so what we can do there is we can reduce that, and it does 2 things. It gets that errant branch that's trying to be taller than the dominant stem in the tree, gets that out of there, but allows that branch to stay, and it slows the growth of that branch down. We've removed the apical bud on that stem, and its growth will slow in relationship to the parent stem.
When doing a reduction cut, do you also take into account the angle of the crotch that you're
Looked at my
using?
next slide, didn't you? Very good. Like this one?
Yeah. Yes.
Very good.
Absolutely would.
Yes, you absolutely would. And here's the answer. So when you make a reduction cut, you don't want to cut down here because that's where the branch is. You don't want to cut right here because that sort of leaves a flat top. You want to sort of draw an imaginary line and cut it like this. Because what you're trying to do, if we're removing this piece here, we're trying to direct all the growth out this way. So if we make that flat cut right there, we're just going to get sprouts there. So if we make it on more of an angle, water's going to hit this and go off rather than sit there. and it's gonna direct the growth up that way.
With young trees, when you do that kind of reduction cut, what you're doing is giving yourself a roadmap to the next time you come through in your cycle. You've also given those branches that you're going to prefer to be permanent branches more room to grow, but then you're not making these large cuts in relationship or ratio to the size of the branch. So those are really important things to keep in mind with young trees. It can get really easy to over prune a tree just by taking off one branch that you really probably should have reduced, leave it there for a few more years, and then come back in a couple of years. We have the benefit on campus to come back every 3 years. Some street trees we prune every year for clearance, but then others it's about a 3-year cycle.
All right, so that's the good. Let's look at the bad and the ugly. This tree was out there. I took a picture of it. What can I tell you? I did not do that. I just saw somebody else did it.
The guy came out and said, "What are you doing in my yard?"
Yeah, it's like I'm just taking a picture. So the point here is that if you don't make the proper cut, remember you're pruning is a wound, right? You're wounding the tree. If you don't make the proper cut, you're doing more damage to that tree than any benefit that tree's going to get from the root. So if you make what we call a flush cut right here, you remove that branch part collar, or if you don't take the weight off and it rips down, you're causing problems for that tree. And here's what the problems look like after maturity. So here's a cut that was not made properly. You've now got a whole bunch of decay. Not only that, you've got another tree species that's not the same one coming out of the crotch of the tree. This is that pre-cut method that Sam just described to you was not done in this case, and you can tell because the weight of this live wood down here underneath the branch.
That mimics a natural failure in a sense. That was a pruning cut, but it mimics a natural failure where the limb came off, tore the wood down the trunk, and now you've got this gaping wound. And what did I say earlier? A tree that has failed is doomed to fail again. And this is essentially a failure. It was just done by improper pruning. And you can see that by the decay that's formed all the way up and another improperly pruned branch above it. So those are all coalescing now into, a two-way tie for last.
This tree only needs one more pruning cut.
That's right.
Thanks. So a bad cut is called a flush cut. And in a flush cut, the wound wood does not, or wound wood or coating does not develop. See this? You got walls here, wall here, but nothing at the top, right? It's not a good thing. All right, I think we've talked a little bit about topping already, so let me just summarize this. It's ugly, it's expensive, it's a waste of money, right? How many of you have never seen a top tree? Yeah, exactly. Okay, it still goes on. Why? People are under the misconception that it's proper pruning, or people are being taken advantage of. I mean, it's basically vandalizing a tree. So that's a maple tree, and this was across the street from a friend of mine. He took it, shook his head. It's like, and this guy was a horticulturalist with the Extension Service, and his neighbor knew he knew about trees, but didn't ask him. And did this, and that's what it looks like a year later, right? You have all of these suckers that Sam mentioned earlier. Those are all weakly attached. That you've interrupted the genetic structure or architecture of that ground, and it's always going to be a problem.
Why are they called water sprouts?
Yes, okay. They call them water sprouts. They are sprouts, water sprouts, suckers. What other names?
I'd be willing to guarantee you that the person that owned that tree talked to the tree guy and said, "I think it's getting too tall. I want it to be shorter." And in 5 years, that tree was probably almost back to the height that it was before. All the energy that was there to support that crown that was lost was still in the tree. And it's just there to replace it. It wants to replace all those lost parts. So they've accomplished nothing with that.
So here's the perspective for you. There is no such thing as a tree that is too tall. Let me repeat that. There is no such thing as a tree that is too tall. A tree cannot get too tall. It only gets as tall as it's genetically programmed to do. You got an oak tree, it's going to grow 80 to 100 feet tall. Have you ever seen a dogwood 80 to 100 feet tall? Nope. Why? Because dogwoods top out at about 30, 35 feet, right? Every tree has a genetic capability of how tall it can get. There's no such thing as a tree that is too tall.
That is one place where trees are like people.
There you go.
They grow to a certain height and then they just start to get bigger.
All right, we need to move on. Let's talk about some hazards related to topping. The tree can't defend the wounds. I have no idea what happened to that picture.
That's
Sorry.
interesting, but it looks like
Sorry.
it looks like an X-ray. Or
That does
something.
look like an X-ray.
You know, that's pretty
That's-
awesome because you can see the discoloration.
Yeah, that's so weird. That picture doesn't look like that. I'm
Pretty
sorry.
wild.
I'm not sure. I should have.
Wow.
Okay. Forster, you already saw this one.
I have to stop and Paul. You have to take ownership of that one and say you did some kind of like regularity on it or something.
Yeah.
I did this. I did this.
Gremlins. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about pruning for the future. There is a whole class of pruning called young tree structural pruning. And what it involves is, and Sam alluded to this earlier, when you have a tree before you plant that tree, you've got it lying down on the ground, that's the best time to say, okay, there's too many branches coming out of right here, or this branch is broken, or these two branches are crossing and rubbing. That's the time to sort of pick. Now, you don't want to massively prune the tree, right? Because why? Because that tree just come out of the nursery and it's left a lot of its roots in the nursery. And so you don't want to cut back the tree to match the fact that the roots have been cut back. You want to give that tree a chance to get established in its landscape and make all the energy you can. So you want to maintain as much branches as you want, but you want the right branches. So what you're going to do is look at how do I make the tree more structurally sound? How do I improve its longevity? Because as I said earlier, pruning a tree when it's young is a lot cheaper than when it's older. And then you want to reduce the likelihood of failure.
So would this be someplace you might be focusing on a young tree?
Yeah,
Possibly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is an ornamental cherry, Quantum cherry, and it's got a whole lot of branches coming out of that same spot right there. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 branches all of a sudden coming out. That tree should have been pruned before it got to the ground. And as it was, when I took that tree was probably about 6 inches around, and it was still small enough that I could get, but I had to make a whole lot more cuts at that point than I would have had to make.
And you would have to do reduction cuts on many of those because you wouldn't want to prune all those branches off in that one point, because you would get decay and it would all coalesce into that one point. And in a strong wind, in a wind, even a young tree could fail at that point with enough decay.
I want to favor one branch over another.
Feedback is to leave that tree alone.
Would it be bad to leave that tree alone? Yes. Well, yes, because you might leave it alone, but Mother Nature won't. So
Yeah.
I have a crystal ball. I can tell you what's going to happen to that tree.
Tell me.
3 letters: ice. What's going to happen is ice. You're going to get an ice storm, and ice is going to form on that, and it's going to be a lot of weight, and that tree's going to go like this. Okay.
Let's talk about ratios.
Sure.
Aspect ratio is something that is a term that's sort of moved up into our industry.
You want
A lot of people know about,
You want to draw?
you draw. A lot of people know aspect ratio as far as camera work or something like that. But what we're talking about is the ratio between the sizes of 2 stems on a tree. So let's see, I can't see what you're doing. Yeah, cool. All right. All right. So the closer 2 stems get to having a 1-to-1 ratio, they're equal to each other, the weaker the attachment of those stems is to each other. And they are both at risk of failures. One will fail, either one could fail. Sometimes it's predictive. If the one branch that has the 1-to-1 to the other, it has a little bit more lean to it, and may have a little bit more risk of failing. But they both are weakly attached in relationship to each other. Am I doing okay?
Yeah.
I think I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
All
Are we
right.
talking about cross angles yet or not?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So when you have one of the structural anomalies that trees get is called codominant stems. And we've got an example here. And
Where's
so
the other one?
it might be floating around somewhere. So when you have two stems that are approximately the same size, those are called codominant stems. And what codominancy means is that they don't have to be the exact same size, but they have to have the exact same aspect or the exact same position in the crown. And a codominant stem is often one of those growth anomalies that the tree develops over time that could be pruned out at an early stage.
These aren't one-to-one, but they're pretty close. And so these could potentially have the risk of breaking out in relationship to the other because they don't. This does have a ridge and a collar, so it may be stronger.
Yeah, it looks like it might be. So generally, there's two types. There's V shape or U shape. The V shape is more likely to have what we call included bark, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But it's bark that forms a little oddly, and U shape is inherently stronger. So if you look at a tree and it's got a U shape in the crown, even though these might be codominant stems, that's going to be a stronger union than this.
You ever pulled apart a wishbone? It's kind of an example of codominance and aspect ratio, and they'll snap apart one break before the other. The whole thing will remain, but one of the bones will break off. It's kind of similar to that.
So let's talk about what a structurally sound tree looks like in the landscape. We have something called scaffold branches. The scaffold branches are the main branches that come off the trunk of the tree that support other branches. We want those scaffold branches to be spaced radially around the tree, not just next to each other. Now, it's sort of a little different with pine trees. Pine trees tend to grow in whorls, right? So there are exceptions to every rule. But the idea here is that we want them to be evenly spaced around the tree, and we're sort of distributing the weight off the tree. And then we want to maintain at least 60%, 50 to 60% live crown ratio. That has to do with pruning for the height of the tree. So if we have a 50-foot tall tree, the lowest limb shouldn't be more than 25 feet up. Okay.
I was just going to use that as an example of that distribution of branching. Of course, this one also has codominant stems because this one's trying to be as tall as this one, so it could use some work. But showing that distribution of branching where there's a branch coming out here towards me and away this way and over this way, and they're well distributed and not coming out of a single point or a very narrow attachment.
So I want to cover very quickly 5 structural causes, structural anomalies that trees develop over time that could be mitigated by early pruning. Codominant stems, which you talked about, include the bark I mentioned, unbalanced canopy, low branches, and crowded scaffold. So here's a picture of codominant stems. We just sort of illustrated this here. Stems nearly the same diameter. You've all seen this in the landscape, I'm sure. Codominant stems are a natural occurrence, but they can cause problems. They don't always, but they can cause problems.
It's very hard to fix this when that tree is that size. I don't know what that diameter is, but it's a very large tree. And you can't do much about that. You have to take other measures like creating artificial support in the upper canopy or something of that sort. But you can fix that when the tree is young. So this example of this codominant stem here, let's say I want this part to be the remaining part, I would come in and reduce this part away. Eventually, this would be removed and this would go away. Or it might take a new roll in the tree. If the branch collar and the ridge are there, you may prune it to this point, and then the new roll becomes this way, and this could stay. So you've got options there. If you leave it, you're going to have fewer and fewer options over time.
Yeah. If you've got codominant stems, you want to remove those as soon as possible. Here's what I just designed. I showed you here, sort of a V shape and a U shape as far as the strength of that. So that leads us into a conversation of included bark. So included bark is a growth anomaly. It's basically defined as bark that's squeezed between 2 stems. The best way I can explain this to you is that included bark, it's an unnatural growth pattern for a tree. And I'll, do you give me a hand here? Second? All right. I'm going to ask you to pull my arms apart. Okay, grab my wrists, pull my arms apart, if you will. So the way that a tree normally grows is it has interlocking cells, right? The cells grow like this together. Try to pull my arm apart. Can't do it, huh? Okay. Well, the included bark, it doesn't grow like that. It grows like this. Now pull my arms apart. Pretty easy, right? That's fundamentally what happens in a case like this. And so what you're looking at right here, and this has been cut off, so it's on the ground. But you're looking at bark. You see how that's squeezed like that? Here's another example in cross section. Now, included bark doesn't necessarily have to be decayed in order to fail. Why? Because it's not a biological failure. It's a physical one. Keep in mind that trees are biological organisms beset by physical factors. Gravity, wind, force, torque, all kinds of things.
You can see in this bottom image that there is a seam that goes all the way through those between those two stems, illustrating even further that somewhere way down they are attached to the parent stem below them, and at some point along that line, one of them will fail, both of them will fail at the same time, depending on the severity of the situation.
Here's an example of, so we got a bark inclusion here. This has been cut for you. You see this crack that comes down below the area that indicates included bark. This is what it looks like when it's failed. So here's two stems, go down the stems if you will. And here's one where you're only seeing the remaining one. That the other one has fallen towards you. Okay. Now, why is this discolored and this isn't? Gravity. This is the decay. This is the biological failure. This is the physics failure. It failed biologically, and then physics took over and ripped down all the student down.
So that had been apart for a while.
Yeah.
Air and water got in there, and decay started forming in those two never to be attached.
Yeah.
Okay. Question. Let's say that decay isn't there, but it's codominant and a storm occurs, yields one call.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do to
Easy answer.
treat that?
Easy answer.
Take it off.
Generally, you can't, because what happens is that what you know about coated and the wound sealing process is not going to happen here. Coated cannot come to fruition on something like that. So you can leave the tree for a while, but it's going to have to be removed. Should I tell them? Should I tell them about the mistake I made with the Supreme Court justice? All right, real quick.
Yeah.
Real quick. All right. So I get called out to the state Supreme Court office building by the grounds manager who I know. He wanted a second opinion on a tree. The tree had an included bark failure like this, and it failed and went off like this. And I looked at it, it was this exact same issue. This was early December. And I said to him, I said, Tom, you're going to have to remove this tree. So put it on your list for the next time you got removals in this area, because CODI's never going to come to fruition there. You might as well just take the tree down. January 2nd or 3rd, first working day after New Year's, that tree fell backwards towards the building, just like this, hit the gutter, because the tree was only 10 feet from the building, hit the gutter, and then slid into the parking lot and landed on the state Supreme Court justice's car. And his brand new law clerk. It was her first day of work. I felt really sad. I felt really bad for her. So I had to get interviewed by the state risk manager, it's like, and I said, look, I told him it was, I did not think it was going to fail, right? I did not think this was going to happen. I told him it had to be removed. It just failed. It just failed again. As Sam said, tree that fails once, bound to fail again. It failed again, and it failed again within a time. In my defense, word got back to me that the Supreme Court justice was not upset that his car got nailed because he wanted a new car anyway. So his wife didn't want to buy one, but now he had to. So he wasn't so bad. The law clerk, I don't think she was sad.
Yeah, right. She probably flinched every time she walked past the tree.
All right. Next, the growth anomaly, unbalanced canopy.
Right, so we see it, like it says here, with wind and snow. We've seen them we've seen junipers on the ocean front where the wind is always blowing in one direction. and it'll get that windswept form. That's one way it happens. If one tree falls into another tree, breaks some branches off of one side, it might be one-sided, and it'll start to correct that growth, and but it'll always be kind of off balance because of that.
One response to unbalanced canopy sometimes people do is what's called line scaling. And that is where you've got all the foliage way out exterior to the tree and nothing in the middle. That is, it actually makes the tree more susceptible. That's an improper pruning technique. Sometimes it's natural, but most of the time it's artificial.
So some of the things that come into play with that is if you strip all the foliage off a branch, part of what happens with having foliage on the branch all the way down to where it's attached, it develops lateral strength all the way through that stem, and it'll be more shaped like a fishing pole than it will be a telephone pole. It'll lose its taper over time. And when it loses its taper, and you've also pruned a bunch of branches off, so now you've got all these little dot-to-dot pruning cuts all over the tree, those are potential decay points into the stem. So now you've got all these little pock marks that have the potential for failing, and the stem can fail because a fishing pole is stronger than a pipe.
Right. Next one, large low branches. This is a case where the bigger the branch at low levels, the more likely you are to have some sort of crack in there or decay. And you can usually avoid those with pruning. So you really want to have branches that are well attached. And here's a couple of sort of cross sections. We showed you that structure, like the shoulder I mentioned. When you have a very narrow branch angle, that's generally weaker than if you have one that comes out in a normal pattern that you've seen.
Yeah, that again is, you've got so many crowded branches, that's something that needs to be addressed early, but you can't, even if you caught that early, you couldn't get them all out of there at once. It's a process. It would take time
Years.
to address that over time. You might select one branch for removal, allow that pruning wound to close, and then choose another one and reduce it so it gets a little bit smaller over time. But you can't just go in there and just fix it in one slash, for sure.
So here's the funny tree. So this was when I used to be on the city forestry staff in Cincinnati, Ohio, a whole lifetime ago. And this tree, this was a ginkgo tree that was growing in the street, and it had all these branches just coming out of one spot. And we had this massive storm. And I went out and saw this tree, and unfortunately I didn't get a picture of it, but I had a picture of it before this happened. A third of the tree had fallen into the neighbor's yard, a third had fallen into the tree lawn, and a third had fallen into the street. And all that was left was a stump about this big. It just exploded from the weight of snow on the tree.
And we often see that in Bradford pear.
Yeah.
I got an example of seeing that on a Bradford pear. That will happen very soon.
Yeah, good point. All right, so to kind of summarize this whole idea of young tree structural pruning. When a tree is young and pruned at proper intervals, it's going to have fewer branches. They're going to be more well spaced along the tree. It's going to have fewer structural defects when it's older, and it's really going to be less costly to maintain.
I'll go back to talking about the university a little bit. We spend a lot of money planting new trees, and it's one of the few assets the university can put into play that doesn't start depreciating the moment we put it in the ground. It appreciates over time. So we have a responsibility. You guys have that responsibility with the city. As you become volunteer forester pruners, that one of the things you're doing is you're providing future healthy growth for the tree as an investment into the asset that the city has put their money into. And to grow over time with healthy growth because of the work.
So prune trees as early as possible. On older trees, it's a tougher call. I mean, you got a tree. I looked at this tree for somebody a while back, and it's like, boy, if you'd pruned this 20 years ago, it would have been fine. But now it's almost too late. Because you're going to cause more damage than you're just going to have to run the risk of leaving it as is. This is a tree that my friend Sarah and I were out looking at trees one time, And this was a maple tree, not very big, but it had so many problems with it. It's probably about 20-foot tall tree. It had, here's it got cut down the stems, here's got included bark. Here it had branches. This is one of the stems, this is the other, and they crossed. And so like this stem started on this side and ended up on the other side. You know, it's like thinking like, why didn't somebody notice this? You know, why is this still, it makes me think, why is this tree here for me to photograph? That's it, really true.
I'm going to interject here. Also, if you're looking at trees in a nursery, let's say you want to buy a tree. If it's got issues like that early on, talk about standards. There are nursery standards for trees, and they should be free of codominant stems. They should be free of crossing branches. They shouldn't have multiple sprouts growing from the base. They shouldn't have wounds on them. And so if you feel like you have to do a lot of correction to that tree before you even put it in the ground, then that's not the tree you should buy.
Right.
And I know that Casey Krause does a lot of work going and selecting trees at the nursery shop in McMinnville, picking the trees that are free of a lot of those problems, so that they're not having to be addressed on site when they come and they get delivered, or become problems like this in the future.
So I want to draw your attention to this tree. I was walking, I saw this tree once here. So here's it in the distance. You see it's got codominant stems. Here's a close-up of that point right there. You look, there's two codominant stems, and then there's like a third area here. Like there must have been a third one at one point that got removed. And here's this, it was a law office, and this is a BMW, and this is a Mercedes. And they're parking right underneath this hazard tree, and it's like, wow. Like, you know, occupational hazard, you know, I couldn't, I look at this all the time.
Right,
It's
yeah.
like, I can't park there.
Well, if you go back to that the slide before that, look how far down that
Yeah,
split
look at
is.
that.
It goes way down.
Yeah.
And in relationship to the height of that tree,
Yep.
that's more than 2/3 of the entire tree
Yeah.
are resting on that weakly attached stem. So there's a lot of leverage, a lot of, a lot of weight that could
It's
build
just
up.
a failure waiting to happen.
Now,
So now that,
due to the majority of the tree, would you have to, you couldn't do any.
It's too late for those.
You'd
Now,
have to
there are,
schedule it.
I mean, there's some ways to mitigate codominant stems, mechanically, like using cabling and bracing, but I don't know if we're gonna get into that too much
Yeah.
here, but I mean, it's a very expensive, time consuming and
Requires an arborist, not a ladder.
yeah. Did you have a question?
I was just wondering if you could band them together or.
So one way to deal with codominant stems is to do what we call cabling and bracing. And what that involves is putting a hook and eyelet in there and then putting a cable between the two, and you're basically holding these two structures together. The challenge with this is you can't just do this and then leave it alone, okay? You have to continually monitor this. You have to check those after every storm to make sure that implementation is still present. So the way I relate it to people is, and keep in mind I work with a lot of youth because I'm a teacher, right? So I said, like, it's really the difference between dating and being married. I mean, once you put a cable in that tree, you've married that tree. You're just gonna have to be responsible for checking it all the time, right? So it's not it's not always something you could do. It's expensive. You got to do it on a tree that's important or a tree that's significant, a tree that has some, planted by your great grandfather or whatever. I mean, whatever it has to be.
It's invasive. It penetrates the central core of the tree. So, and that brings wall one into focus and allows the decay to move, longitudinally through the tree because of that potential wound that you put with the hardware that you've done. So, it's a trade-off. Big time.
Yeah. So let's kind of recap the steps for training in trees. We talked about removing broken, dead, and diseased branches, selecting central leaders or dominants. We talked about that. Selecting and establishing the lowest permanent branch. We didn't necessarily do that, but we can do that real quickly. When you've got a tree that you've planted, all these low branches are going to be temporary. At some point, you're going to have permanent branches that are going to be, present for the whole thing that are never going to be removed. But remember, a tree grows two ways. It goes up and goes out at the same time. So you're never going to see the future structure of it. You're just going to have to imagine it.
Yeah, you just have to see what's coming in advance.
Yeah.
Most of the trees you'll be working with are young trees that don't have any of their permanent branches at all.
So one way to do this is to think about pruning as a process, identify what stem will make the tree better, identify what the competing leaders are, and then decide where to shorten those stems and, what cuts to make. Some trees have a lot of really aggressive branches that want to compete with that central leader. And so a lot of that is, again, I use that word subordinate. What we're doing is we're subordinating these branches to the other ones that allow those to maintain the position in the crown of the tree.
Those are reduction cuts, and those are also done in favor of, you don't want to remove those branches too early in the life of the tree. You'll be making branch cuts that are too large in comparison.
Yes.
I know
So
this sounds a little repetitive, but
yeah. So here's before and after. Here's before. We're going to remove this branch and this branch. This is what it looks like. Remember this. This looks like a good haircut. You can't tell what's been done. This has been a very strategic and specific pruning job for a primary reason of making sure that leader maintains the stop.
and up there somewhere are the permanent branches. But you don't know which ones they are yet. I think you're not making that decision. You're just getting room for everything to grow, and you're reducing the rapidity of the growth down here, so that eventually you'll take one or two of those off at a time, not at the same time, but you'll pick a time.
Yeah.
Great example. That
Yeah.
illustration is fantastic.
Yeah, we talked about temporary versus permanent branches and about clearances. Eventually all these low branches are going to go because the tree's going to put on more branches up and out of the tree. So if you think of it as a young tree, all the branches are temporary. Go, 5-10 years, you've got some permanent canopy up there. You still have some temporary branches, and then as the tree gets older and 30-40 years even, it's got the right structure that tree needs.
I'll go back to that last. Anybody have a venture a guess why this illustration shows branches on the trunk, on the lower trunk, below some of those branches?
Here.
Those little sprout. They play a really important role for the tree. If you take those off, then you've taken off the potential for energy capture for the tree.
Yep.
So often we'll leave sprouts on the base of the tree, just so that, if we just know that they're going to provide sugars to the lower stem. Sometimes if we get a branch that gets ripped off the tree and it sprouts, we'll leave those sprouts around it because we know the sugars are providing energy to the wound to allow it to close over.
Yeah.
So we're using the tree biology to improve the health of the tree due to an errant wound of some sort.
You were saying earlier, I heard a slide way earlier that said something about not cutting down the tree, the little ones especially. Is this, are you there? My intuition is to say that you would want, if you're going to grow faster, taller, would maybe not want it to be wasting its energy on both branches, or is it because it's so young that it needs
Right.
proximity to the
I think I'm getting that. I'm pretty sure I know where you're getting to with that. So it's a trade-off, I think. I think more often than not, I would choose leaving some of the sprouts on there, just because it's providing energy to the entire tree.
And to the roots. I mean, once you got a tree planted, you want it to put on root growth. So I'm a little less concerned about what the top looks like for the first year or two while it gets roots established. Then I'll start removing them. Sophie?
So does that apply to like stump sprouts or sprouts coming up from the velvet?
Potentially, sometimes stump sprouts can be an indication of a health issue.
Yeah.
So if you've got a lot of profuse sprouting coming from the base of the tree, then probably what you should do is look at the crown and see if you have plenty of live crown up at the top. If you've got dead branches up in the top, and especially if it's a young tree, you've got dead branches and sprouts at the base, you've got an issue going on with the root system.
However, some species sprout more than
They do. Yeah.
crabapple, for example.
Mhm. Yeah.
When do you take those off?
As the tree gets older, you
Yeah.
start removing.
Yeah, you start removing.
Well, mine was when you, I wouldn't take them off in the spring, because they're generating
Yeah,
food.
yeah.
But in the winter time, if you're going to take them off,
That's the time to do
That's the
it.
time to
That's
do it.
good. So I've got a dogwood in my front yard. My granddaughter planted it when she was 4, so it's been in the ground for 3 years. She's 7. When she's 5, she's 8. So 3 years. It's only about this tall. His name is Jack. Don't ask me why. So she called her Jack. And it looks like a bush almost. I mean, it's got really low branches. And what I'm doing is I'm waiting for it to get taller so then I can start removing those lower branches as the tree gets up. But I didn't want to remove all those branches because I wanted the leaf surface area for that tree to be able to photosynthesize. You all remember that from 5th grade science, photosynthesis, how the tree makes energy, sunlight, right? Okay, so I wanted that tree to use those leaves to photosynthesize and to channel that energy into growing into that tree and getting it well established. And now it's been in the ground 3 years, and it's now probably, I don't know, 4 feet tall. Even though it looks kind of like a shrub, this winter, I'm going to start taking those lower branches off so that it can begin to shoot up. Okay,
We're getting a little deep on that.
we are getting a little deep.
Yeah.
Let's go. I think we've kind of gone through that one. I'm gonna jump ahead here a little bit. All right. Proper pruning. Our goal is for the health and safety and for that tree to look good in the landscape. We're going to remove those dead branches, improve the structure, and provide clearance and increase the health of that tree. That's what we're doing. How you do that, so there's a lot of ways to do it, okay? A lot of moving parts, a lot of things. What we tried to do this evening is to kind of give you an idea of the factors that come into play, the thought process that somebody like Sam uses when he goes out into the garden here and sees a tree and says, okay, that tree needs to be pruned. Why am I pruning it? How am I going to prune it? And what is it going to look like at the end?
Go back to talking about vision. You're using your eyes to prune the tree. That's not just you looking at the tree. It's your vision of the tree in your mind too. And you have to take that in as you're assessing the tree that's in front of you.
All right. Now, here's the part where we can do this outside. Can't do it outside now, it's dark. But I've done it for you. So I planted a tree, and I said, you know, one of these days in the future, I'm going to be standing in a classroom while it's raining outside, having to describe pruning. I might as well just prune this tree and take a picture of every step. So that's what I did. This is a bur oak tree that I planted, and it was in the ground probably about 2-3 years, and I decided it needs a young tree structural pruning intervention. Got a lot of branches, and so that's what I did. So here's an example. Take a look at this. It's got a branch here, a branch here. Right here, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can't see this 5th one in the back, all coming out of the same spot. I'm not going to remove all 5 of them, right? I want some branch structure to it, so I'm going to have to pick the best ones. So here's an example. I'm going to say, all right, the first one is I really don't need this branch that's going down like this. So you can see, here's the example. I cut it off, right? I just took this branch because it's going downward and it's a low branch. I don't really need it. Temporary branch anyway. Here's my saw. And I'm going to say, okay, the next thing I'm going to do is this branch. I got 20 branches that are all in the same spot. This one's smallest. I'm going to go ahead and take this one because I really want to favor these larger ones. So I took it off. So here's the cut. It was only a little cut. That cut's about the size diameter of your thumb, right? But it's important enough. So you can see here's before, here's after. I made that cut. I made that cut. Again, I'm deciding what to favor. That's the art part, right? You're deciding, you're making the decision of what to favor. So here's this kind of knuckle. I got all these branches out. It's like, okay, I got to take one. Got my hand pruner, I'll take the small one. Got my bigger saw, I'll take the bigger one. And here's before and after. You know, looks pretty good, really. You can tell something's been done. All right. You want to take us out? We're almost back.
Sure. Yeah. So what he was just talking about, when you've got a properly pruned tree, you've got good branch spacing. You've selected for the best branch structure of the branches that are on the tree. All right. They've got a better chance of being long-living, healthy trees. And then all of these in red are going to come into play. If you don't prune the tree, or if you prune the tree improperly, you're going to have a chance of risking all of these kind of issues coming along. And we know that for you guys, topping is not going to come into play. And we think over time, you're going to be really good at identifying the branch bark collar, the branch bark ridge, and you're going to bring into play the 3-cut method so that, this right-hand side, all of these red vines aren't gonna be an issue for you guys. You're gonna walk out of here, and there's gonna be enough light for you to see trees, and you're gonna be looking at them going, what would I do with that tree?
Yeah.
And I told you that at the front of this. That's the way it's gonna work. You're stuck with it. I'm in your head.
All right, one more round of Stump the Arborist. Don't look at the screen, Sam. Don't look at the screen, Sam. All right. Sam,
Paul,
should I use wound paint?
absolutely not.
What was the question?
Should I use wound paint? Should I paint the tree after I prune it? Should I paint it? Why not?
No, absolutely not. It's not worth the extra money. It's not worth the extra time. And you're thwarting natural processes that are taking place. We talked earlier about when you prune a branch, things start happening right away. That's not a joke. There are beneficial bacteria and fungi that find wounds out of the air. They come to pruning wounds and they attach themselves to the tree to protect the tree from what? Detrimental bacteria and fungi. So boring starts happening right on the surface of that pruning cup. Internal, we're talking about auxin comes into play with the plant. Tyloses, I mentioned that a little while ago, where the cells start plugging up in the canyon around the wound to keep bacterial and fungi and air from getting into the tree. And when we put wound paint over that, we've stopped all of that. We've thwarted everything that could be taking place. Trees are super survivors. They've got to process to protect themselves. They need us as associates to do the job for them every once in a while.
But can you still buy tree wound paint at the hardware store?
Heck yeah. Yeah, you sure
Why?
can.
Yeah, you can. All right. So we have given you over 50 years worth of tree pruning wisdom today between the two of us, more than that, it's probably 70. And but we can't tell you everything, right? It's a process. You're going to need to learn. Here's a book that will help you. Many of the slides that you've seen tonight came from Dr. Ed Gilman. Some of the images, rather, in the slides came from my colleague, Dr. Ed Gilman. He's a retired professor of urban forestry at University of Florida. And Ed was probably the foremost expert on pruning in the entire country. And he wrote a book called The Illustrated Guide to Pruning. It's like now the third edition or fourth, I'm not sure. This book's, it's a paperback. It's about, I don't know, 35, 40 bucks. Maybe you can probably buy a used copy. But anyway, I highly recommend this book. It's got, you know, a lot of what we covered tonight and even more that we didn't have time.
You can also search Ed Gilman on the web, and most of his research and publications that he did through Florida, University of Florida, are still online, still out there for public consumption. And he's also involved with an organization called the Urban Forest Institute, which provides technical support to landscape architects for design standards, planning standards, things like that. So,
and then, so learn all you can about pruning, read this book if you can, and then practice. I mean, it takes practice to be a good tree pruner. You'll get there. There are a lot of, volunteer to help people, parks, schools, there's no shortage of trees that need to be pruned. And it's a great winter activity.
I'm really glad you guys are doing this. Your future self will thank you.